So in a matter of minutes, the Supreme Court will hear arguments on the strictest abortion law in the country. The Texas measure bans most abortions and allows people to sue others who break the law. But the issue the court will decide on after today's hearing isn't whether or not it's constitutional. So I want to bring in Jessica Levinson to explain. She's a CBS News legal contributor and a professor at Loyola Law School. So thank you so much for joining us. So kind of, the heartbeat component of this law has gotten a lot of attention, but the other component, I think, is kind of the more challenging component that allows people to sue those who violate the law. Usually, it's the state that enforces a law. In this case, that's not what's happening. So, Jessica, what exactly is the issue before the court today?
Who can sue and be sued to stop this law? So exactly as you said, what typically happens is Texas would pass this law. We would all look at it and frankly say, well, under Roe and under Casey, this is not constitutional. Women have a constitutionally protected right to obtain an abortion, at least up until 24 weeks of pregnancy. This essentially bans all abortions after 6 weeks. And then we would sue in federal court. The federal judge would say, nope, we're going to have to push this on pause. This law cannot go into effect. But what Texas did here is they said, we're outsourcing the enforcement, exactly as you just said. So it's not Texas that sues to enforce the law. It's a private individual. And in fact, any private individual anywhere in the country. So when this challenge first started, abortion providers sued, and this went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the court basically said, yeah, I'm not really sure you even sued the right people. So today in the Supreme Court, the question is basically two things. Can the Department of Justice, the federal government, sue the state of Texas to stop this law? And can abortion providers sue state officials to stop this law? So it's really these threshold procedural questions that are so important, not just in this case, but in a lot of other cases where states might try and design similar laws that the court is going to tackle in just a few minutes.
So what kind of precedent would a ruling on these cases set, Jessica?
So I think a very bad one. It would set the precedent that states can outsource enforcement, step one, but by doing so, if the Supreme Court rules in favor of Texas, I should say, what kind of precedent would this set if the Supreme Court rules in favor of Texas? It would essentially take the power of judicial review for potentially blatantly unconstitutional laws away from federal courts. So let's give another example. Let's say Congress passes a law that says you're not allowed to criticize members of Congress. We can all imagine why they would do this. And they would say, but we're not going to enforce it. Private individuals will sue the people who disparage us. If today the Supreme Court says that the Department of Justice can't sue Texas, that abortion providers can't sue state officials to stop this law, it's hard to see how in that case you could ever ask a federal court to step in and stop what is obviously a horrible intrusion into First Amendment rights. Now, if the court rules the other way, if they say, yes, Department of Justice or abortion providers, you can go forward, then it would essentially bring us back to something closer to what we're used to, which is if there is a law that looks clearly unconstitutional, you can go to a federal judge and stop it before it goes into effect.
So in September, this law came up again with the Supreme Court. The court allowed the law to remain in place when it was challenged. That vote came down to a 5-4 decision, with Chief Justice Roberts siding with the liberal-leaning justices in their dissent. And what he wrote was, in his opinion, that he would delay the law from being implemented until the courts could settle the issues at hand. What does this tell you about where the justices stand? Or maybe not much, because it seems like what we're looking at now is an entirely different issue.
It does and it doesn't. So I was thinking about that in the sense of, what does it tell us in terms of where they stand on abortion? Well, on the one hand, maybe not that much. They're struggling with a procedural question, which frankly, I think they needed to tackle. But The question was, wow, Texas set up this really strange enforcement mechanism. Who can stop it? But if you think back to our example of Congress passes a law saying, don't criticize members of Congress, I have to think the court would have found a way to say that law is not going into effect. So for me, it actually does indicate that at the very least, the court is treating a woman's still constitutionally protected right to obtain access to an abortion with a fairly cavalier attitude. They still, even though the procedural questions are complex and novel, they still let a law that can no way be consistent with Roe versus Wade go into effect in the second most populous state in the country.
What kind of impact, Jessica, could the decision in this case have on the challenge to Mississippi's abortion law, which is scheduled for a month from today?
Yeah, this is, talk about a blockbuster term, now already adding more blockbuster cases. So the question in Texas, as we've been talking about, is this threshold question of who can sue to stop this law and who can be sued. Now, Mississippi asked basically the second question, which is now that we're in court, what is currently the law when it comes to women's right to obtain access to an abortion? As we said, the current standard really comes from a 1992 case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that essentially says pre-viability, which is about 24 weeks, states you can't implement undue burdens. It's not a great standard, but it's the standard we have. Mississippi essentially bans all abortions after 15 weeks. 15 weeks, obviously, before 24 weeks, and a ban, obviously, more than an undue burden. So there's no way that Mississippi's law can stand and be consistent with Casey. And that's the case where the court will hear that second question, which is, what is constitutionally protected in America today? I suspect, given the fact that the court decided to take the question at all, that it might say we're narrowing the scope of Roe and Casey, meaning they would uphold that Mississippi law. That still wouldn't mean Texas's law is constitutional. Texas's law is 6 weeks. So we have to wait to see how the court writes its opinion in the Mississippi case.
We have another big case on the Supreme Court's docket this week. It involves gun rights. Arguments are set for Wednesday. Can you walk us through that case and explain what's at stake here?
Yeah, what's at stake here is really the scope of the individual right under the Second Amendment to own and use firearms. And so by way of background, we know that the court really hasn't tackled a big Second Amendment case in about a decade now. And a number of conservative justices, primarily Justice Clarence Thomas, has said, is this now not a real right anymore? Do we treat the Second Amendment as different because we're not accepting cases? Composition of the Supreme Court changes. They accept this case out of New York, which essentially deals with whether or not you have to give a, quote unquote, good reason like self-defense in order to obtain a concealed carry permit. And it goes to this question that was kind of left unanswered back in 2008 when the court made its very famous decision in Heller, which is how far does this individual right to bear arms go? Before 2008, it wasn't clear if I had an individual right to bear arms or just if it was the militia. So this will follow up. I think looking at this court, it's not the last big gun control case that we will get in the coming years.
All right, Jessica Levinson, always great to have you breaking this all down for us. We appreciate it as always. Thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, you can stream today's Supreme Court arguments at 10 a.m. Eastern by downloading our free CBS News app or visiting cbsnews.com/court.